The Cold Touch. True scary stories of sleep paralysis and echoes in the dark. Chapter 1. The First Night. John Andrews was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man living a predictable life. At 34 years old, he worked as a marketing consultant in a small but steady firm downtown, spent his evenings unwinding with a good book or a glass of whiskey, and led a life that was as stable as it was routine. Yet, beneath this seemingly calm surface, something had begun to shift. Over the past few weeks, his nights had become increasingly restless. His sleep, once an escape from the pressures of daily life, had transformed into something far more sinister, an unsettling place where peace was hard to come by. It had started with nothing more than a few bad nights of tossing and turning, plagued by a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't explain. At first, John chalked it up to stress, the sort of thing that comes with being overworked. He told himself it would pass, like the countless other minor annoyances in life that eventually fade away. But the discomfort lingered, gradually worsening, until it became something he could no longer ignore. That night, when it finally happened, was different. John had fallen asleep on his back, something he rarely did. As he drifted off, he felt a peculiar heaviness press down on his chest. It was subtle at first, like a weight, but it grew steadily, suffocating him, robbing him of breath. He tried to shift, to turn his body, but his limbs felt locked, paralyzed in place. Panic set in. His mind was fully awake, racing with questions, but his body refused to obey. His heart pounded furiously against his ribcage, the sound echoing in his ears, drowning out everything else. He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound came. He was trapped, fully conscious yet imprisoned within his own body. Then, amidst the rising terror, it came, the touch. A cold, unnatural sensation crept over his chest, starting as a faint pressure and growing more defined by the second. It wasn't the sort of cold you'd feel in the middle of winter or from a drafty window. This was something else, something far more chilling. It was as though something, or someone, was there, right beside him, its hand pressing into his skin, its icy fingers curling around his ribs. John's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any sign of movement, any clue to the presence he was now certain was there. But the room was still, bathed in the soft, muted glow of the street lamp outside. Everything looked exactly as it should have, familiar, unchanged. But that didn't make the sensation any less real. In fact, it made it worse. The coldness spread, traveling across his chest and up to his neck. He could feel it so distinctly now, as though a hand, invisible yet terrifyingly real, was gripping him. His mind screamed at him to move, to fight, but his body remained paralyzed, locked in a state of frozen terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The weight was gone, the cold hand vanishing without a trace, leaving John gasping for air as if he'd just been released from an unseen grip. His body, free from its paralysis, jerked upright, drenched in sweat. He sat there, gulping in breaths, his pulse racing, every muscle in his body trembling. For a long moment, he simply sat in the darkness, trying to calm himself, to make sense of what had just happened. His rational mind struggled to explain it away. Maybe it was just a vivid nightmare, nothing more. But the vividness of the experience made that explanation feel hollow. He could still feel the ghostly chill lingering on his skin, and no amount of logic could convince him it had been a dream. The rest of the night passed in fits and starts. John drifted in and out of a restless sleep, haunted by the memory of that cold, unseen hand. When morning finally came, it was a relief, even though his exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. The next day, John tried to brush it off, though the memory of the night before hung over him like a dark cloud. At work, he struggled to focus, his thoughts continually drifting back to that paralyzing moment, the suffocating terror. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel that touch, still hear the frantic pounding of his own heart. By lunchtime, he couldn't stand it anymore. He needed answers, some kind of reassurance that what had happened to him was in fact normal, or at least explainable. His fingers hovered over the keyboard at his desk before he hesitantly typed the words, "sleep paralysis." The results were instant. Dozens of articles, forums, and medical studies flooded his screen, all detailing similar experiences. People trapped in their bodies during sleep, unable to move, often accompanied by feelings of dread, pressure on the chest, or the sense of an ominous presence in the room. The accounts were all eerily similar to his own, yet somehow that didn't make him feel better. If anything, it made the whole ordeal feel more real. One article in particular caught his eye. It was a personal account posted on a popular website, written by someone who had experienced sleep paralysis for years. The descriptions matched his exactly, down to the chilling detail of an unseen entity touching them during the episode. The author described feeling a cold hand pressing against their body, just as John had felt. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Some people claim to have experienced it only once or twice, while others described recurring episodes that grew more intense over time. John shut the laptop, feeling no more comforted than before. If anything, the realization that others had experienced the same thing made him feel like he was part of some horrific shared nightmare. That night, as he got ready for bed, a growing sense of dread built in his chest. He turned the lights off and climbed into bed, but his mind refused to settle. The sheets felt too heavy, the air too still. Every small sound in the room seemed amplified. A creak in the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator down the hall. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, a single question circled through his mind. Would it happen again? The answer was one he feared to find out. Chapter 2. The Cold Hand Returns. John barely slept the night after his first encounter with the icy grip. Every creak of the house, every subtle whisper of wind outside his window, was enough to keep him on edge. His body was exhausted, yearning for rest, but his mind refused to let go, haunted by the memory of that cold, invisible hand. Each time he closed his eyes, he could still feel it, the unnatural chill creeping over his chest, a sensation so vivid it sent shivers through him long after it had disappeared. But exhaustion, no matter how stubbornly resisted, always wins in the end. By the second night, John's body simply couldn't fight back. As the darkness settled over his room once more, and the slow hum of his fan filled the air, he drifted off into a fitful, uneasy sleep. It came again, quicker this time, almost as if it had been waiting for him to fall into that vulnerable state. He awoke to the same paralyzing weight pressing down on his chest, but this time it was worse. His limbs, stiff and unmovable, felt heavier than before, and though his eyes darted wildly beneath his eyelids, his body was locked in place, utterly unresponsive. Panic set in immediately, the familiar sensation of helplessness wrapping around him like chains. But what terrified him more than anything was the cold hand. It wasn't just a touch anymore, it was a presence. John could feel it distinctly, clearly, as if someone was crouching next to him, their fingers brushing over his skin with a slow, deliberate motion. The hand, colder than ice, trailed from his chest to his neck, lingering with a malevolent intent that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a fleeting sensation like the night before. This time, it stayed, caressing him with a twisted, almost possessive nature. He tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break free, but his body remained frozen in place. The hand moved again, this time sliding up to his throat, and for a horrifying moment, John was sure it would tighten, that it would strangle him right there in his bed. But instead, it rested there, cold as death, while the room around him seemed to close in. And then came the whispers. Faint at first, like distant echoes bouncing off the walls, the whispers grew louder with each passing second. The voices, soft, unintelligible, circled him, spinning like a storm around his bed. He strained to listen, desperate to understand what they were saying. But the words remained just out of reach, slipping through his grasp like water. The cold hand still lingered on his throat, and with each whisper that filled the room, the air seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. It was as though the house itself had become an accomplice to the terror, the very walls closing in to suffocate him. Just when he thought he couldn't take it any longer, the whispers stopped. The hand lifted, and John gasped for air, his lungs filling with oxygen like they hadn't in minutes. His body jerked violently awake, releasing him from its frozen grip. He sat up, his hands clutching at his throat, half expecting to find bruises or marks, but there was nothing. His skin was unblemished, though it still tingled with the memory of that freezing touch. The silence of his room felt wrong, almost too quiet in the wake of the chaos that had just unfolded. John's chest rose and fell rapidly as he struggled to calm down, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of the presence that had haunted him. But there was nothing except the deafening quiet. The next morning, John's mind was fogged with confusion and fear. His thoughts were scattered, barely coherent, as he replayed the events of the previous night in his head over and over again. It was getting worse, more intense. The paralysis, the cold touch, the whispers. It was like something was toying with him, testing his limits. He knew he couldn't just let it continue without answers. His search for information grew frantic. Every spare moment at work, in the quiet moments between meetings or during lunch, he found himself scrolling through articles, forums, and blogs. He read everything he could find on sleep paralysis, trying to convince himself that it was all in his head, a natural phenomenon that his stressed mind was amplifying. But deep down, he knew something was wrong, something more than just a psychological condition. Late that night, as he lay in bed with his phone screen illuminating the darkened room, he stumbled upon a website filled with true scary stories. At first, it was a simple distraction, a way to read something different, something that might take his mind off his own fear. But as he clicked through the pages, something caught his eye. A story, one that felt chillingly familiar. The writer described in vivid detail their own experience with sleep paralysis. They too had felt a weight pressing down on their chest, a cold hand tracing their skin. The writer mentioned the whispers, the eerie sensation of being watched, even when no one was there. But what terrified John the most was the ending. The writer had gone on to describe how, after weeks of experiencing the paralysis, they had begun to notice strange marks on their body. Bruises, scratches that hadn't been there when they fell asleep. The post ended abruptly, with no follow-up. John's heart raced as he read the comments beneath the post, where other users speculated about the writer's fate. Some claimed the account was nothing more than fiction, while others believed the person had met an untimely end. But one thing stood out. Several users had described their own encounters with the cold touch, and each of their stories seemed to follow the same pattern. And then came the final revelation, buried deep in a comment thread. Those who feel the cold hand too many times don't live long enough to tell their story. The words sent a chill down John's spine. His mind reeled with the implications. Could that be what was happening to him? Was it a warning? Was he next? As the days passed, John's fear began to seep into every aspect of his life. He couldn't focus at work. His thoughts were clouded, his attention slipping. Conversations with his colleagues felt distant, like he was moving through life in a fog. The sleepless nights, filled with dread and the weight of the cold hand, had taken their toll on him physically and mentally. At home, his apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards a reminder that something was there, something waiting for him to fall asleep. He avoided looking in mirrors, afraid of what he might see staring back at him. Even during the day, the cold touch seemed to follow him, lingering in the back of his mind like a predator waiting to strike. John became paranoid, barely able to distinguish between what was real and what was the product of his sleep-deprived mind. His world grew smaller, more isolated, as he pulled away from friends and family, unwilling to explain the unexplainable. What would they think? That he was losing his mind? But John knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary nightmare. This was something more, something far more dangerous than anything his rational mind could explain. The cold hand was real, and it wasn't done with him yet. Chapter 3. Echoes in the Dark. The nights became a battleground John never anticipated. The cold hand had started to linger in his mind, even when he was awake, as if it was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. His exhaustion was taking a visible toll, his eyes bloodshot, his skin pale. But instead of yielding to the creeping terror, John resolved to fight back, to understand what was happening to him. He had to know the truth. Days passed with little sleep. John spent every waking moment immersed in research, his apartment now littered with printouts, books, and his laptop always on, glowing eerily in the darkness. He visited medical forums on sleep disorders, hoping for some rational explanation for what he was experiencing. There were accounts of sleep paralysis that resembled his, but none quite captured the cold, invasive touch, nor the chilling whispers that had surrounded him in those terrifying moments. The more he searched, the less sense it all made. It was as if there were no logical answers, only shadows hiding the truth. As desperation set in, John found himself wandering beyond the scientific realm. He started exploring forums dedicated to the occult, his rational mind telling him it was absurd, but a deeper, more primal instinct urged him to continue. He stumbled across a discussion thread on a forum that caught his eye. A user had written about their experiences with sleep paralysis, much like his own, but with one critical difference. The user claimed that their episodes weren't merely medical phenomena, but the work of something supernatural, an entity that preyed on its victims while they slept. As John read through the thread, a name surfaced repeatedly: the spirit of the cold touch. The theory was unnerving. This wasn't just sleep paralysis, the user had insisted, but an ancient spirit attempting to break into the physical world by manipulating its victim's body. The more John read, the more it all seemed to align with what he had felt: the malevolent presence, the cold, ghostly hand, the whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. John's heartbeat quickened. Could it be real? Could there truly be something more sinister at play? Something beyond the scope of science? He needed answers, and quickly. His search led him to an unlikely source: Dr. Evelyn Green, a researcher in the paranormal. She had written extensively about sleep phenomena that crossed into the realm of the supernatural, documenting stories from ancient legends and contemporary cases alike. Her articles, though few, painted a chilling picture of spirits that fed off the vulnerability of sleepers, gaining strength through repeated encounters. John tracked down her contact information and sent an email outlining his experiences in as much detail as he could. He expected it to go unanswered, dismissed as a delusion, but within hours, she responded. Dr. Green's office was in a part of town that felt worlds away from where John lived, an old Victorian building that seemed oddly fitting for a paranormal researcher. The place had an air of age and mystery, the wood creaking beneath his feet as he walked through the hallway leading to her office. Dr. Green was in her early 40s, her sharp eyes betraying a mind always at work, always observing. She welcomed him into her office, which was cluttered with books, artifacts, and curiosities, each one hinting at a history far older than anything John could comprehend. She gestured for him to sit, her expression serious. "So, you've experienced the cold touch," she said, her voice low but filled with a weight that made John feel as though she had heard this all before. John nodded, recounting his experiences in vivid detail: the paralysis, the whispers, the cold hand that seemed all too real. Dr. Green listened intently, occasionally nodding, her hands steepled as she took in every word. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath. "You're not the first," she said softly, her eyes narrowing. "There are stories, legends that go back centuries across different cultures. The entity you describe, the one that manifests through sleep paralysis, it's something ancient." John's pulse quickened as she spoke. It's said to be a spirit that feeds on the vulnerable, those who are trapped between the waking world and the dream world. Sleep paralysis is its method of entry, its way of binding its victim. The cold touch is more than just a sensation, it's the spirit attempting to break through, to take control of your body while you're immobilized. John swallowed hard. But why me? Why now? Dr. Green tilted her head slightly, considering his question. It could be any number of reasons. Stress, trauma, emotional vulnerability. All these things can weaken the veil between worlds. And once the spirit has found a way in, it won't stop. It gets stronger with each encounter. The whispers you heard, the cold hand, those are just the beginning. If you don't find a way to stop it, the next time could be worse. John felt a chill run down his spine. He thought back to the increasing intensity of the episodes, the way the hand had lingered longer each time, the whispers growing louder. The idea of facing another night like the last filled him with dread. "Is there a way to stop it?" he asked, his voice shaky. Dr. Green hesitated, her gaze steady. "There are ways to protect yourself, but it won't be easy. You'll have to confront it, make it know you're not a passive victim. You must establish boundaries, both mentally and spiritually." John blinked. "Mentally? Spiritually?" She leaned forward, her tone intense. "This entity preys on fear, on your own doubt. You need to gain control over your mind to resist it. But more than that, you need to protect yourself spiritually. There are rituals, protective symbols, but they only work if you truly believe in their power. This thing, it wants to break you." John left Dr. Green's office feeling both reassured and terrified. He now had some understanding of what he was up against, but the solution seemed abstract, fragile. How was he supposed to stand up to something that could attack him when he was at his most defenseless? That night, John lay awake in bed, waiting. His heart raced as he stared at the ceiling, his mind playing over Dr. Green's words. He had scrawled a symbol on a piece of paper and placed it under his pillow, hoping it might offer some semblance of protection. But the truth was, he was afraid, and he knew the entity could sense it. Hours passed, but eventually his body gave in to exhaustion, pulling him into a fitful sleep. The paralysis struck almost instantly this time. John's eyes opened, and once again he was trapped in his own body, unable to move. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, the darkness around him thicker, as if the very shadows in the room had taken on a life of their own. The whispers returned, louder than ever before. They filled the room, overlapping, disjointed, like countless voices speaking at once, their words impossible to make out. The noise surrounded him, growing in intensity, pressing in on him from all sides. Then, the cold hand. It touched him again, this time on his arm, slowly sliding up toward his chest. It was no longer subtle. There was force behind it, like it was trying to pull him into the void, to drag him away from his body. His heart raced as he fought against the paralysis, willing himself to move, to break free, but the force was too strong. The hand gripped him tighter, and for the first time he felt its fingers, thin, bony, and icy cold. The whispers were now deafening, a cacophony of voices echoing in the dark. It was as if the spirit was toying with him, pulling him deeper into the abyss with every second. John's vision blurred as the weight on his chest intensified, pressing down with terrifying strength. His body trembled beneath the force, and for a fleeting moment, he was sure that this was it, that the entity had finally won. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room went silent, the cold hand disappeared, and John gasped, bolting upright, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He was free, for now. But he knew the spirit wasn't done with him yet. It was only getting started. Chapter 4. The Mark of Death. The days after John's latest encounter with the cold hand were marked by an unshakable dread. Each second felt like a countdown to some unknown catastrophe. He tried to go through the motions of daily life, but nothing seemed normal anymore. His mind was consumed by the encounters, especially the growing sense that he had been chosen by something sinister. He couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Green had told him, that the spirit would keep coming for him, each time closer, each time stronger. And there was a part of him, buried beneath the layers of fear and fatigue, that knew there was more to it. Something worse. Something final. Determined to uncover the truth, John spent hours locked in his apartment, poring over every detail he could find. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. The research led him to chilling accounts, testimonies from people who had experienced similar hauntings. The cold touch, the feeling of helplessness, and most disturbingly, their slow descent into madness. One particular story stood out. A man named Marcus, from a small town in Eastern Europe, had written about his encounters with a malevolent force. His description was eerily similar to John's: the cold hand, the whispers, the paralysis. But there was one detail that made John's blood run cold. Marcus had experienced the cold touch exactly 3 times. The third time had been different. He had woken up, gasping for air, certain he was dying. Within days, Marcus had vanished without a trace. The locals spoke in hushed whispers about his disappearance, but no one could explain it. His body had never been found. The more John read, the more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Each victim, across various countries and over many years, shared one commonality. They had all been marked by the spirit after repeated encounters. The cold hand was not just a ghostly manifestation, it was a signature, a seal of death. The more frequent the touch, the closer the spirit was to claiming its victim. John had already felt it twice. Panic began to gnaw at him. making each night feel like a ticking time bomb. He knew he couldn't handle this alone anymore. It was time to confide in someone who might help him stay grounded, someone who could see the danger from a different perspective. Lucy had always been his closest friend, the one person who wouldn't judge him for his escalating paranoia. She had seen him through other rough patches in life, though none were quite like this. That afternoon, John called her, his voice strained with the weight of his fear. They met at a small cafe, a quiet place that once would have felt comforting. But even as he sat there, John couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Lucy arrived, her face bright with concern as she slid into the seat across from him. She glanced at him, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, the gauntness in his face. "John, you look like you haven't slept in days. What's going on?" He forced a small, bitter smile. "I haven't. That's the problem." As they spoke, John slowly unfolded the story he had been carrying around. The sleep paralysis, the icy hand, the whispers, and the terror that gripped him each night. At first, Lucy's expression was one of sympathy mixed with doubt. She tried to offer explanations: stress, exhaustion, the pressure of work, anything that might rationalize what he was saying. But the more he explained, the more it became clear that this was beyond rationality. "And it's not just nightmares," he finished, his voice low. "I'm being marked. This spirit, or whatever it is, it's already touched me twice. I think I'm running out of time." Lucy sat back, her brow furrowed in concern. "John, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like you're sleep deprived. You're probably just imagining some of this, right?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, it's real, Lucy. I can feel it. I've read the stories, people who've felt the same thing, the same cold touch. They all died after the third encounter." His hands trembled as he spoke. "And I've already felt it twice." Lucy stared at him, the skepticism in her eyes slowly giving way to worry. She had known John for years, and he wasn't the type to make up wild tales or fall into paranoia. He was logical, steady. But now, she could see something was deeply wrong. "Okay," she said finally, her voice softening. "Let's not dismiss this. I'll help you. Maybe we can figure this out together." John exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening just a bit. "Thank you. I'm not sure how much time I have before it happens again, but I feel like I'm on borrowed time." Lucy gave a reassuring smile. "We'll figure something out, John. You're not alone in this." Lucy stayed true to her word. That night, she scoured the internet for anything that might help, looking into cases similar to John's, finding forums and articles that delved into sleep paralysis, folklore, and the supernatural. She called him with updates, sharing stories of strange deaths and unexplained phenomena. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. But no amount of research or support could prepare John for what happened next. The third encounter came without warning. John had tried to avoid sleep, his body protesting against the exhaustion that gripped him. But no matter how hard he tried to stay awake, his body eventually succumbed, pulling him into the inevitable. This time, the paralysis hit almost immediately, locking him in place before he even realized he had fallen asleep. His mind screamed for him to move, but his limbs refused to obey. The darkness in the room seemed thicker, more oppressive than before. And the cold hand, oh God, the cold hand was back. It didn't simply brush against him this time. It clamped around his throat. John's eyes flew open in sheer terror as the hand tightened its grip, cold fingers pressing into his flesh. He could feel every bony digit as they constricted around his neck, suffocating him. His lungs burned, his chest heaved for air, but nothing came. The pressure was unbearable, and in his ears the whispers returned, louder than ever. They surrounded him, insidious and mocking, as if the spirit was savoring this moment of triumph. His vision blurred. He was slipping away, the world around him darkening as his breath ran out. The cold grip was relentless, dragging him closer to the abyss. For a horrifying moment, John was sure he was going to die. This was how it ended. The third touch, the mark of death. But just as his mind teetered on the edge of oblivion, the pressure suddenly released. John jolted awake, gasping, his hands flying to his neck. He could still feel the ghost of the icy fingers around his throat, the sensation too real to dismiss as a dream. He sat there, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was alive? But for how long? It was only a matter of time before the spirit returned to claim what it wanted. Chapter 5: The Final Countdown. The weight of impending doom hung over John like a suffocating fog. Each passing hour felt heavier, more dangerous, as though the walls of reality were crumbling under the pressure of the malevolent force that had taken hold of his life. Sleep was no longer a respite, it was a battleground, one he was quickly losing. He knew that if he didn't act soon, the cold hand would return to finish what it had started. The thought of that icy grip seizing him again was unbearable, yet he knew that avoiding sleep altogether wasn't an option. His body would betray him eventually, no matter how hard he fought to stay awake. Desperation led him back to Dr. Green, the one person who understood the true terror of what was happening. John had hoped there might be a simple solution, a way to sever the connection, without delving into the unknown. But there were no easy answers left. When he met the professor at his small, cluttered office, the room seemed darker than before, as if even the air recognized the gravity of their conversation. Dr. Green's eyes were grave as he studied John's haggard appearance. "I've been researching this more deeply, John. There's only one way I know of that might give you a chance to survive." John leaned forward, heart pounding in his chest. "What is it? What do I have to do?" The professor hesitated, clearly troubled by what he was about to say. "There's a ritual. It's ancient, passed down through different cultures that believed in these kinds of spirits. The ritual is dangerous, but it's designed to confront the spirit directly." "Confront it?" John repeated, his throat tightening. "You mean, face it head-on?" Dr. Green nodded slowly. "Yes, the spirit has attached itself to you, using your sleep paralysis as a way to cross over into our world. To sever the connection, you'll need to face it in the dream state where it holds the most power. But be warned, John, this ritual is not just about surviving the encounter. You will need to banish it, force it back into whatever plane it came from. If you fail, well, you may never wake up." The words hit John like a physical blow. The idea of willingly facing that cold, malevolent presence sent a shiver down his spine. But what choice did he have? The spirit had already claimed others, and it had marked him as its next victim. If he did nothing, it was only a matter of time before the final touch came. "How do I perform the ritual?" John's voice was hoarse, as though it took all his strength to ask the question. Dr. Green handed him a tattered piece of parchment with instructions written in a language John didn't recognize. The paper felt old, as if it had been passed through many hands over centuries. "You'll need to perform this while in the dream state. There's a chant, a series of symbols you need to visualize, and most importantly, you have to remain calm. If you lose control, the spirit will have full dominion over you." John swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he took the parchment. "How do I even know when I'm dreaming? How do I enter this dream state on purpose?" "That's the difficult part," Dr. Green admitted. "You'll have to walk the line between sleep and consciousness, a lucid dream. It won't be easy, especially with the spirit fighting you every step of the way. But once you're there, you'll know. It will feel different." John returned to his apartment that evening, his mind swirling with thoughts of the ritual. The instructions seemed almost impossible, but he had no other options. The spirit would return, and when it did, he had to be ready. The weight of the upcoming battle pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. He paced the small living room, feeling as though the very walls were closing in, echoing the darkness that awaited him each night. The only person he trusted to share this burden was Lucy. She had been his anchor in this spiraling descent into madness, the one person who still saw him as human amidst the growing fear. He called her, needing her presence more than ever. When she arrived, her face was lined with worry. "John, what's going on? You sounded different on the phone." He gestured for her to sit, his hands shaking as he explained what Dr. Green had told him. He went over every detail of the ritual, the risks, and what would happen if he failed. The more he spoke, the more he could see the horror dawning on her face. "John, you can't do this," she finally said, her voice breaking with emotion. "This isn't safe. You're talking about putting yourself in danger in a place where I can't help you. What if something goes wrong? What if you don't wake up?" He looked at her, the desperation clear in his eyes. "Lucy, if I don't do this, I'm going to die. It's already touched me 3 times. The next time, I might not make it. This is my only shot." Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped his hands. "There has to be another way. We can find something else, some other solution. I can't lose you, John." Her words cut deep, and for a moment he wavered. But he knew there was no alternative. The spirit had marked him, and it wasn't going to stop. He couldn't keep running from it forever. "I have to try, Lucy," he whispered. "I can't live in fear like this, and if I don't do anything, I won't live much longer anyway." She stared at him, her face pale and stricken. "Then I'm staying with you. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." That night, Lucy sat vigil by his bedside as John prepared for what felt like the longest night of his life. He had memorized the chant and practiced the symbols over and over in his mind. The air was thick with tension as he lay down, trying to calm his nerves, though his heart raced like a drumbeat. He didn't know how long it would take before the spirit came, but he knew it was close. As the hours passed, John hovered between wakefulness and sleep, his mind slipping in and out of consciousness. He felt the familiar weightlessness, the sensation of falling, but he clung to the edges of awareness. He needed to be alert for what was coming. Then it happened. The air in the room shifted, growing impossibly cold. His body locked in place, the familiar paralysis gripping him like iron chains. He was no longer just lying in bed. He was trapped, floating somewhere between the real world and the nightmare. His eyes darted around the room, and in the periphery of his vision, he saw it. Shadows moving, closing in on him. The cold hand came next, slithering over his chest like a snake. But this time, it wasn't satisfied with just a touch. It tightened, pressing harder, as though trying to pull him out of his body. His breath hitched, the darkness pressing down on him from all sides. This was the 4th time. John tried to remember the chant, his mind scrambling to recall the words. The cold hand was relentless, icy fingers sliding up toward his throat. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let fear take control. He began the chant, his voice shaky and weak. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but he kept going, repeating the phrases over and over as the pressure mounted. The spirit wasn't retreating, it was pulling him deeper. Chapter 6. The Cold Touch. John sat at the edge of his bed, the parchment with the ritual's instructions trembling in his hands. The weight of what was to come bore down on him like an impending storm. His breaths were shallow, his body tense, and the room felt claustrophobic, as though the walls themselves were closing in. This was it, the final confrontation. He would either succeed tonight or lose everything. The cold hand would return for the last time, and there was no telling what would happen if he wasn't ready. Dr. Green and Lucy stood nearby, their expressions a mixture of fear and concern. Lucy's eyes were red from sleepless nights spent worrying over him, but she had refused to leave his side. Dr. Green's normally calm demeanor now cracked, revealing the unease beneath his scholarly exterior. They both knew the risks involved in what John was about to do, but they had no choice. Time had run out. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Lucy asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile silence in the room. John nodded, though his insides churned with uncertainty. "If I don't, I'm already dead," he replied, his voice flat, drained of emotion. He had already made peace with his decision, though fear gnawed at him with every heartbeat. "This is the only way." Dr. Green approached, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The moment you enter the dream state, you'll be vulnerable. The spirit will be there, waiting for you. Remember the chant, and don't let it distract you. Focus on the symbols, visualize them clearly. They are your only weapon in the dream." John clenched the old parchment tightly, nodding as he absorbed Dr. Green's words. But even with all the preparation, nothing could truly ready him for what was about to happen. Facing the spirit in its own domain was beyond anything he could comprehend. Lucy stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched John's arm. "Please, don't try to be a hero. If things go wrong, just come back to me." Her plea was filled with desperation, but John could only offer her a sad smile. He didn't have the heart to tell her that coming back might not be an option. "I'll do my best," he said, though he doubted his own words. The ritual began. Dr. Green set up the necessary elements, lighting candles and spreading an array of ancient symbols drawn in chalk across the floor. The room took on an otherworldly quality, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. John lay down on the bed, feeling the familiar sensation of sleep creeping up on him. His eyelids grew heavier with each passing second. As he drifted toward unconsciousness, Lucy and Dr. Green watched in silence, their faces tense with worry. John clung to the fading edges of wakefulness, forcing his mind to stay focused as the darkness began to engulf him. He had to maintain control. This was the moment everything hinged on. Then, the void swallowed him whole. John found himself standing in a vast, empty expanse, a black void stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming silence that pressed in on him like a suffocating weight. It was as if the very air around him had been sucked away, leaving behind only a cold, oppressive stillness. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he looked around, but there was nothing to see, nothing but the infinite darkness. He had entered the nightmare, the realm where the spirit resided. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in the silence like the ticking of a clock counting down to his doom. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The air turned frigid, and the unmistakable sensation of the cold hand brushed against his skin. It was faint at first, but then the touch grew stronger, more deliberate, as though the spirit was announcing its presence. John's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had prepared for this moment, and he couldn't let fear take over. From the shadows, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was nothing more than a faint outline in the darkness, a distortion of the air itself. But as it drew closer, it became clearer. The figure was tall and gaunt, its form skeletal and shrouded in tattered robes that seemed to blend into the surrounding void. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a twisted, contorted mask of malice, its eyes empty pits of darkness that seemed to bore into John's very soul. This was the entity behind the cold touch, the spirit that had stalked him relentlessly, waiting for the moment to claim him. John's throat tightened as the figure loomed before him, its presence radiating a palpable sense of dread. But he couldn't let it overwhelm him. He began the chant, his voice steady despite the terror threatening to consume him. The ancient words flowed from his lips, and as he spoke, the symbols from the ritual began to materialize in his mind. The spirit recoiled slightly, as though the chant was pushing it back. For a fleeting moment, John felt a surge of hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe he could banish the entity once and for all. But the spirit did not retreat fully. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, its cold touch intensifying. That's when the truth hit him. The spirit wasn't trying to kill him. It had never intended to end his life. All along, it had been preparing him, marking him as a vessel. The cold touch wasn't a precursor to death. It was the spirit's way of integrating itself into his body. It had been slowly merging with him, waiting for the right moment to cross fully into the real world. John's stomach churned with the horrifying realization. He had misunderstood everything. The spirit didn't want him dead. It wanted his body. Panic flared in his chest, but he couldn't stop now. The chant faltered on his lips as the spirit surged forward, its skeletal hand reaching for him. The cold enveloped him entirely, and he felt his body begin to slip away, as though his consciousness was being torn apart from within. The void twisted around him, and suddenly he wasn't alone. He could feel the presence of the spirit inside him, crawling beneath his skin, trying to take control. His mind screamed in protest, but his body was no longer his own. The spirit was winning. There was only one option left. John had to trap the spirit here, in the dream world. But doing so would mean sacrificing his own consciousness, his very existence. He would never wake up again. His body would be left in the real world, but his mind would remain here, locked in an eternal struggle with the spirit. It was the only way to stop it from crossing over. Tears stung his eyes as the weight of the decision settled over him. He thought of Lucy, of the life he would be giving up. But he couldn't let the spirit win. He couldn't allow it to use him as a gateway to wreak havoc on the real world. With one final burst of strength, John focused all of his willpower on the symbols, visualizing them with perfect clarity. The chant rose once more in his throat, louder and more powerful than before. The void trembled, and the spirit shrieked in rage as the symbols glowed brightly, forming a barrier around them both. "I won't let you in," John whispered through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the pain tearing through him. The spirit thrashed wildly, but it couldn't break free. John's consciousness began to fade, slipping away into the darkness as he completed the final part of the ritual. He could feel himself sinking deeper into the dream world, his connection to the real world severing with every passing second. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the spirit's cold, hollow eyes staring back at him, furious and defeated. John never woke up. His body remained in the hospital, kept alive by machines, but his mind was gone. Lucy visited him every day, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, hoping for a miracle that would never come. She knew the truth now, though it brought her no comfort. John had saved her, saved them all, but the price had been his own soul.